This is Paranormal Borders Lab Podcast, brought to you by the Mexicali Biennial, with your host, Ed Gomez.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you again for being part of this podcast. This is the Paranormal Border Podcast. We look at everything paranormal, and this part of this project is helping the Mexicali Biennial help to define what normal is so that we can contrast with what paranormal is. And today we're happy to have Ana Muñiz. Did I say that right? Good. Ana Muñiz. Ana is a trained sociologist and associate professor of criminology, law, and society at UC Irvine. Ana grew up in Tucson, so I hope we can maybe unpack some of that. Some people call it Tucson, right? But I know it as Tucson, Arizona, and she currently lives in Los Angeles, California. She's the author of Police, Power, and Production of Racial Boundaries and Borderland Circuitry, Immigration, Surveillance in the United States and Beyond. And I think that was what first got me interested in your work because of our Borderland programs with the Mexicali Biennial. And Borderland Circuitry, Immigration Surveillance in the United States and Beyond examines the intricate connections between digital surveillance, immigration control, and gang enforcement. The book delves into the evolution of surveillance systems since the 1980s. It's interesting to see how that evolves now that we're in the 2025s, right? Highlighting how information sharing partnerships among local police, state, and federal law enforcement and international entities have led to the creation of multi-digital boundaries or borderlands. So thank you again for being part of this Paranormal Border Podcast. We're super happy and excited to have you here. But first, let's start out with Tucson. What was it like growing up in Tucson?
Tucson was a great place to grow up. It was a place I eventually needed to leave, and it's a place I feel when I go back now, I really love it and also feel a little stifled. But I loved growing up in the desert, so I'm very connected to the land. I feel deeply connected to the land there and always have. It was great to grow up in open space, in open desert and with mountains. I became a runner very early in my life, so in elementary school and middle school, so spent a lot of my time running and getting to know the desert and getting to know the land and the plants and the animals, and that is still the place I feel most connected to. And in all my work throughout my writing, whether I intend it to or not, I always end up writing about the land a lot.
Did that help formulate some of the concepts around this Borderland Circuitry book that you did?
Definitely. So when I was growing up, and what I write about in the book is the border was just a more porous place. Of course, the border was always there. Of course, there was always Border Patrol. Of course, there were always horrible things that happened with people crossing the border, and there was a lot of trauma there that the border existed, but it wasn't as reified and militarized, I think, as it is now. So it was much more common, particularly before September 11th, when there was instituted new regulations around needing like a border crossing card or a passport or something like that. People went back and forth a lot more casually. So for one, there was just the border in many more places, I think, was just a barbed wire, a sort of just a little barbed wire fence. And so it was just easier. And then it was just easier for some people to cross at points of entry. So I remember when I was young, my mom and my stepdad, taking us across for lunch. My dad and my stepmom at one point crossed a lot, pretty frequently, pretty casually. And that has obviously changed. And one thing I've found very painful is the destruction of land on the border, which is so beautiful. And the interruption of migration traditions for both animals and indigenous peoples, migration traditions that have been blocked by the buildup of the border. So yes, I was very interested in this simultaneous physical buildup of the border. So building larger walls, steel walls, concrete walls, less and less of the border looking like that thin edge of barbed wire, as Gloria Anzaldúa put it. But also this move to sort of digitize the border. So the physical buildup of the border at the same time that the border is becoming this invisible digital flow that covers much more space and goes far beyond the border. And a lot of surveillance studies, focuses on this idea of surveillance flows and amalgamations. And so things are very disembodied. And I was really interested in how it comes back to land. And I hadn't seen a lot of that in surveillance work, sort of how we think about these digital surveillance flows relating to land and contributing to this destruction of land.
So this digital surveillance flow, have you been able to pinpoint where it comes from and why it's being implemented?
Well, there's been this buildup sort of since the post-September 11th era. There's been this effort, one, to build bigger databases and to make them more interoperable. And so one thing that's happening is we're just getting these gigantic databases that are holding lots of people's information. And I looked at immigration databases, so databases that particularly hold information on people who are not U.S. citizens. But they're becoming also more interoperable with other databases. So I traced the way, for example, that these federal databases are interoperable and exchange information with databases that are maintained by local police and police at the state level and county level. And was particularly focused on gang databases because those are databases where a ton of information is held on mainly young people of color in urban spaces, and particularly young men of color. And we know that with a lot of the right-wing rhetoric around immigration control is justified really focuses on this idea of gang members, right? And that gang members are crossing the border in huge numbers. And so there's definitely this effort to exchange information for ICE to get more information from local police about the people that they've identified as gang members, and to really target those people for enforcement, to detain them, to put them in expedited deportation. And so, yes, I wanted to understand how, again, to bring it to like ground these surveillance flows, like how they're functioning jurisdictionally. So how a young person of color on the street, for example, gets labeled as a gang member by a local police officer, and then that information makes its way from that local police department's database to a state-level database that has an information sharing agreement with ICE, and then that information makes its way to ICE and puts that person at risk for immigration detention and deportation.
That's fascinating. You almost wonder if how many times they get it wrong, right? How easy is it to mislabel someone, right? Have you encountered situations like that?
Yeah, so much of my work, the first book I wrote, Police Power and the Production of Racial Boundaries, and much of my early work really looked at the way that police designate people as alleged gang members or associates on the street. And one of the reason police and law enforcement at all levels find the gang member label so useful is because it is so easy to apply. There's basically like no threshold for application. And so they can, without much justification, sweep large numbers of people in a specific area into these databases and hold their information. So most local law enforcement agencies use a 9 or 10 point criteria, and people have to fit usually two of them to be considered a gang member. And they are things like frequenting a gang area. But you can also live. I've seen many times people live in gang areas, and they are said to fit that criteria because they're frequenting the area that they live. Another criteria that's often used is associating with other alleged gang members. This is often neighbors. It could be people in your family. So if your family member has been labeled a gang member, you can be labeled by association. Things like wearing gang clothing, which is defined really broadly. It can be a shirt of a certain color. It can be a widely worn sports team. I did ethnographies with police in LA who considered LA Dodgers gear to qualify as gang attire. So it's really almost anyone in an area can fit them. When I lived in a neighborhood that was considered a gang area, I could fit those criteria. But of course, a wide range of people are not labeled as gang members, even though they could be based on that criteria. It tends to focus disproportionately on young Black men, and secondarily on young Latino men. So it's very easy to apply in terms of like accuracy. I mean, these databases are over-inclusive. They're often inaccurate. So you have these really questionable labels at the local level making their way up to the federal level, and being very consequential for if people are not citizens. It's really consequential for their ability to stay in the country.
How could one find out if you're on this list? And if you are on this list in error, how could someone get off the list?
It depends. So in California, there were reforms passed around 2014. And so now any police department that adds an individual to a gang database is required to notify them, or if they're a minor, notify their guardians. I think we don't quite know how much that actually happens. Like, there's not a ton of enforcement mechanisms or oversight mechanisms to make sure that every department is sending out a notification every time they add someone. But you do have a right to know if you're on a database. So you can, even if you didn't receive a letter, or you may have had your information put on that database a long time ago and it was never taken off, and so you didn't get a letter because that law wasn't retroactive, you can request to know if you're on that database, and then you do have a right to removal, some sort of application for removal.
Was that like expensive to do, or is it just based off knowledge, being knowledgeable in the process and what's actually happening? Or
yeah, it's knowledgeable in the process, and this is one of the gap between a right and actually being able to access that right. So in my experience, so if you're going to appeal your placement on one of these gang databases, for example, like CalGang, which is the statewide one in California that I cover in the book, that used to connect to an ICE gang database. If you were to request to be taken off that database, you could do it yourself, but people are much more successful if they have a lawyer help them do it. But you don't have a right as part of that process to have free counsel. So you don't necessarily have you don't get a public defender or something. So it's people are much more successful when they have legal help, but you can do it on your own.
So how could this affect someone, let's say, applying for a job, whether it's like a city or state job? Is that something that would pop up on a background check?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. I've also seen stories about Los Angeles sheriff deputies having a gang. Is there a gang on this list of known gangs? Or
no, so that's the really revealing thing. And me and other scholars write about this a lot, that this is an inherently racialized label, right? That this is kind of a proxy for racial profiling. And we see that from the fact that you have the definition of a gang, is generally a group of three or more people that share a common symbol and engage in some sort of criminal activity. And we can see how that could fit a wide range of groups. I mean, that could fit fraternities that haze people. It could fit white supremacist gangs. So it can fit these broad range of groups, but really it's only applied to people, generally to Black and brown men in low-income urban areas, right? So the sheriff's gang, the sheriffs released a statement. They refused to call them a gang. So they do have deputies who have tattoos. They share a common symbol. They're more than three people. There's journalists the Knock LA did a great spread on this, where they found evidence that these sheriff's deputies were assaulting people in the community and moving up in their gang for it, getting sort of points for it. But the sheriff refers to them as cliques. So officially, the sheriff's office will only call them cliques. They won't call them gangs. So we see how this idea of gang member is really reserved for specific people. During the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, the Phoenix DA and I think it was Salt Lake City DA, they both tried to prosecute Black Lives Matter protesters as gang members. And they claimed that they were wearing the same shirts, which were black shirts. They were chanting the same things, so they constituted a gang and could be prosecuted as a gang. Now, we don't see those efforts being applied to white supremacist groups, right, who killed someone in Charlottesville or January 6 protesters. So when you really examine, the gang member label is something that's really supposed to scare people into submission and encourage people to accept, saturation policing and police violence, and to make people, scared enough to accept these really restrictive immigration policies. But when you just scratch below the surface, you realize how absurd and racialized that label is.
Yeah, and I think about the whole ecosystem that it lives in, right? Because if you get more people arrested, then you can put them into prisons, and prisons can make more money, right? And if you need more information, then you can create a corporation or a company that's going to store data and collect data, and then you can make money off of that. So the more information you have, the more resources you have, the more money you need to spend, or even justifying larger police budgets because you have all these criminals on the streets, right? Like, have you been able to identify any of those connections, or is it more dealing just with these profiles and these databases? And
my work doesn't touch on as much on this sort of private-public partnership when it comes to data analysis, but it's a huge issue. I touch on it a little bit, and we see even right now Palantir and Alex Karp really jumping at this opportunity under Trump to do these mass deportations. So it was just reported that there was this call between the Trump administration, and I think it was Blackwater, which that's a name from the past, right?
Eric, various iterations of names, right, as they get sued.
Yeah. Eric Prince of Blackwater and Alex Karp of Palantir and someone from Amazon. And, they're really giddy about the possibility of building databases and data analysis tools to help deport people. And that's really the issue that law enforcement agencies have, is they have so much information, but it's difficult sometimes to analyze that information in effective ways and to process it in effective ways. And so often these tech companies like Palantir or Amazon, what they're pitching to government officials is this way to sort of effectively organize and analyze the data and make it useful and efficient. So there's definitely that. There's definitely that connection. And absolutely, I mean, you sort of picked up, this is a larger logic around law enforcement, this circular logic about, you could say, if you're saying that, in Cal Gang, we show we have 200,000 gang members, your argument, and they could say that's grown since last year. Your argument could be then, well, you're not doing a very good job with your war on gangs, so maybe you should be defunded. But that never happened. So law enforcement has this circular logic where if they have databases showing greater number of gang members, then they need more resources to fight those gang members, right? And if they have fewer numbers, then it means what they're doing is effective, and they need more money to keep doing that. So it all goes back for them, like however the outcome is, it all goes back to them to just needing more money. But the immigration industry in general, it's much more privatized than other areas than the criminal justice system. So there's much more privatized detention centers. And so there is absolutely in the immigration system this incentive, right, to process more people, to arrest more people, to detain more people.
Yeah, I think it makes sense to try to find ways to analyze data, especially when you're collecting so much data and you have data collection services. When I remember as a kid, we were all anti the system and bureaucracy, and we're never going to get chipped. We're never going to have them chip us, and then we all have cell phones and we chipped ourselves, right? And how much of that device mines information, sometimes anonymously, sometimes not not so anonymously. And then the question becomes like, what do you do with that information, right? I think I'm hearing more and more about artificial intelligence coming in and using algorithms to sift through large bodies of information, which is all great and all, but what happens when you get that wrong? And who gets to control the algorithm, right? Like that's something that's really scary.
Yeah, and Virginia Eubanks and Ruha Benjamin are two scholars who do really great work on this. And Virginia Eubanks published a book a while ago called Automating Inequality, which is exactly about that, which is if you make a mistake, it's scaled at such a larger number. So if you have, she was particularly looking at insurance. So insurance, what gets flagged for insurance fraud. And instead of having individual people go through this and flag it, if you train an algorithm to do it, but there's an error in there, it's going through a much larger group of people, and so that error is going to be compounded. But there is also, which you're referring to, right? Who gets to control the algorithm? There has been this false narrative that somehow technology and AI is going to be less biased and more egalitarian. But what we find over and over again is we just embed our biases into technology. So Benjamin's book, Race After Technology, is really great about this. And that can be anything like going through welfare rolls and flagging people who have names, right? Names that in her book, she looks at the names that are stereotypically associated with Black people, and so that those get flagged because we put our biases in there about who is committing welfare fraud. But there's all these ways in which biases are embedded into technology. I mean, facial recognition technology has been proven to work less effectively on people with darker skin. So it can't read faces as well if people are darker skinned. And that's because of what the tool was trained on. It was trained on faces with lighter skin. And so you have more people getting wrongly identified from facial recognition. So there is no, and what I really write about in the book is about these sort of the nuts and bolts of immigration surveillance and these data systems and these automated tools. But it also is really arguing that there is no savior. Like, we're always looking for this savior where we can sidestep these really difficult political questions about who is human and who is not, and like how much cruelty and inhumanity and inequality we're willing to deal with. And over and over again, I think people look to technology to sort of sidestep these questions, but we are in that technology. Our politics are in that technology. So eventually, you just have to face the hard political questions about who gets dehumanized.
Yeah, it just takes a while before like a hacker group comes in and then twists the algorithm so that it goes after corrupt politicians, law enforcement, the military-industrial complex. Like, it'd be interesting to see if that ever gets flipped the other way, right? Or if it's just going to continue being focused on a very like racist kind of a way in which it just really discriminates one group, very select group, and leaves the other ones free, right? That would be an interesting flip in the script. Early on, you also mentioned growing up in Tucson and experiencing the border in a very different way than it is right now. Right now, we have the Trump wall. We have layers of barbed wire on top of the expanded wall. And I remember having a conversation with you about NACO and the volleyball game.
Yeah.
If you want to maybe tell our viewers a little bit about that.
Yeah. So there was this great volleyball game, and I think it was Univision that did a great piece on it several years ago. But the residents of Naco, Arizona and Naco, Sonora used to have a cross-border volleyball game, and the fence was short enough where they could play volleyball over it. And then the losing side had to throw a party for the winning side on their side of the border. So there were holes in the fencing. Again, this was like the border was not built up as much, so you could do this in more places. So people used to slip, whoever lost used to host the party, and whoever won used to just slip through holes in the fencing to the other side of the border and have drinks and food. And after September 11th, with the border buildup, that wall became built up too high. for people to play over it. And as you've experienced in your work on the border, there's also just a lot of barriers where you can't actually even get up to the border wall in some places, right? Because they have these barriers where there's sort of a no-go zone around it. And that to me is really this. It symbolizes a few things. It's that things like that volleyball game and different things like that happened in a lot of communities along the border. Really emphasizes the beauty of people understanding that it's just a fence. Like, you know, some people really reify it and put all this meaning into it and, you know, go to such lengths to defend it. But ultimately, at some point, someone just drew a line and like put a fence there. But the desert, to me, I think of just the Sonoran Desert. So for me, the Sonoran Desert is continuous across the border. And so that's how I think of that space. And so early on, people, you know, didn't think much of that fence. You would slip through it. And I really think of that as a very beautiful, and in a way, a radical act to just so casually reject, right, this powerful construction of the border and this assertion of control and forcing you to define insiders and outsiders. And then, of course, it also symbolizes the evolution of that control to the border we have now, which is this effort. People have long built community across the border. And again, like your work has been, right, this effort to do that. And you've encountered all sorts of communities that do that, who just make a community despite the border between them. But that's just getting increasingly like physically harder to do.
Yeah, I think this administration, one of the first things they did was they sent 500 Marines directly to the border in a display of theater with helicopters hovering, and since then they've sent 1,500 additional troops and armored personnel carrier vehicles, and it's creating really this presence of hostility under the guise of safety, right? Including designating many cartels as terrorist organizations, which then opens up, you know, a huge portfolio of possibilities, which the current defense minister said that all options are on the table, right? And when you think about what the options and those options can actually be, then, you know, we're on the brink of another Tom Clancy novel, right? Where we have this war breaking out and things just destabilizing. So, you know, in 2009, we did the soccer match game on the border, and we used the center. We used the actual wall itself as a midfield for the soccer match. And so when I saw the photos that you sent me about Nako and the volleyball game, I thought that was just an amazing act of like community coming together, right? Realizing that the border is, you know, just defense. Families can be on both sides. Language bleeds from one side or the other. Culture bleeds from one side or the other. Commerce goes back and forth, but yet we have this wall, right?
Yeah. Commerce is the one thing that's allowed to go back and forth.
Yeah, right, from NAFTA on, right? And then, you know, when you say the word the frontera in Spanish, it's this idea of frontier, and it's this ever expanding frontier, right? Historically speaking, it's, you know, we talk about the indigenous groups that lived in the area, then we talk about Spanish, and then we talk about this Mexico being established, and then these borders being created. Do you see in the future the American empire expanding both north and south?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, it's hard to say with this administration sort of making all these, you know, assertions now about doing that in these radical ways. What I looked at in Borderland Circuitry and what I'm interested in is this concept that's called border externalization, and there's also border internalization. So border internalization is this idea that the border as this mechanism of control is actually spreading inward for some people, right? And people are being subject to border-like control in the interior of the country. So one way that would happen is through databases, for example, and policing. But also border externalization is a dynamic that the U.S. has engaged in for quite a long time, which is this effort to stop people before they reach U.S. borders. You know, before it was before Guantanamo Bay became known as this place where alleged terrorists were held indefinitely, right, and tortured. It was Haitian immigrants were detained at Guantanamo Bay, and the idea being, if the Coast Guard can stop people pretty far out, and they can't actually reach U.S. soil, they can't access certain rights, certain claims to asylum and other things. And so the U.S. has long tried to strike agreements with other countries to detain people who are on their way to the U.S. Further out, right, in other countries, or have provided aid and struck agreements with countries to build up their borders. So, for example, with Mexico to build up their border with Guatemala so that people get stopped there who are coming from further south. So the U.S. has had, has tried to develop and has developed detention centers overseas like this. And so in this way, you have the U.S. sort of engaging in a subtle version of that through border externalization for quite some time.
And how important was NAFTA in all this?
Yeah, I think it was incredibly important. It is, one of the primary reasons you had that increase in migration from the South, because so many people were put out of work by NAFTA. It crashed the farming economy, and people went searching for work. And really, it was, this idea got locked in, that of, neoliberalism, of this idea of deregulation, and as we said, this free movement of commerce. And simultaneously with the free movement of commerce came this idea that people should not have free movement, right? Commerce should move freely, but people needed to be more heavily regulated and controlled.
That's interesting. Yeah, because, living through that, and then I think for me the next step was like 9/11 and then the Patriot Act, right? And I feel like now we're waiting for like this next step.
Yes.
And I think the designation of these cartels as terrorist organizations is going to drastically change. And then what's going to happen with the Mexican government, right? And we already saw how these tariffs that were threatened are now being pulled back. If Mexico agrees to certain conditions, then that's going to affect everything that way. What's happening internally with the police state and how these databases are collected and used to, designate certain people as, let's say, gang members. How similar is that with other databases that designate people as immigrants? And is it the same system? Is it the same administration or policies? Or is it coming from a specific point that I imagine like the one for the border would be from like a federal standpoint,
right.
And one more, and what we experience in the streets of LA could be, county or city or even state. But I'm just curious as to how similar those systems are, right? If they were created specifically for different purposes, or if it's the same thing just in a different iteration.
Yeah, that's a great question. This is where actually tech companies come in. So if you're looking at databases, they can look different on the federal level and the local level, and also depending specifically on which agency runs them. But this is where it comes back to sort of like who's designing the database. And often with law enforcement agencies, they're not internally designing the database, right? They're having a private contractor design those databases. So there's been an effort to make a lot of databases look more similar so that they can interface more seamlessly. I think there's been challenges with that. But for example, in the book, I look at there is a company called SRA International that developed the Cow Gang database and a lot of big gang databases across the U.S. And one of their pitches when they pitch law enforcement is, when they build your database and you use their software, you essentially you're immediately interoperable with all these other databases. You get all this information. So a lot of the state databases under them can be interoperable if that agency chooses, so that Cow Gang can be interoperable with the Arizona Gang database and Nevada's database and so on. And in 2006, SRA built a database that mirrored Cow Gang for ICE. So they built a database called ICE Gangs. And so those databases look, almost identical. Like it's just the ICE one was just a federal iteration of the state one. The idea being, again, so that like also you wouldn't have as many issues when you try to make them interoperable.
Have you had a chance to actually examine these databases, and is it just metadata, or does it?
Yeah.
In some circumstances, I imagine it's actually the person's name, birth date, and all that. But how much of it is general versus very, very specific?
Yeah. So as part of the book, one of the way I got most of the data that I analyze in the book is I did Freedom of Information Act requests to ICE and DHS and USCIS and several local police departments in the state of California. And we had to, particularly, which is often the case when you submit a FOIA to a federal agency, they don't even acknowledge it. Like you get the sort of automated email that tells you that they've received it and they're processing it. But really you have to sue in order to get the thing you request. And so I worked with a lawyer, Matthew Strugar, who is really great, and filed lawsuits on FOIA lawsuits on my behalf against ICE and DHS and USCIS. And that's a long, protracted struggle then about trying to access as much information as possible. And so they release documents. There's a struggle over redaction. So obviously ICE, for example, wants to redact as much as they can. And it was my attorney, Matthew Strugar's job to try to get, the redactions down to a reasonable amount. So all the data I analyze in there is never before seen data that documents on these internal databases that tells us how these databases work really for the first time. So that was everything from like the contractors' agreements. There was a lot of general information on how the database systems were working. I did not get people's names or identifying information, and that's something I did not request because I knew it wouldn't be granted and it would be used as an excuse to reject my request. But I did get a lot of aggregate information. So, for example, I got the number of people on the ICE gangs database between certain dates, which countries they were from, their gender, their racial identification. So sort of all this aggregate data that tells us not specifically who's in the databases, but generally sort of who tends to be targeted in these databases.
Okay, so I'm just trying to wrap my head around this. So I'm curious as to where obviously where the data starts, but also where it ends.
Yeah.
Like, are they going to go in and be like, oh, well, you shop at Whole Foods, so, you're in this category, or you shop at the local bodega, that's also a red flag that's going to, put you in this different type of category. Like, how much of your daily life is actually put into these databases to classify you as either a criminal or not a criminal or gang affiliated or legal or illegal? Like, were you able to glean any information in terms of that, or?
Not as much, no. When I was looking at the immigration databases, the immigration databases, the gang databases, they all include that sort of the basic information about people's demographics and identifying marks, scars, tattoos, things like that. There is an effort with gang databases to do sort of network analysis, so to connect like cars to certain people or places to certain people. And so they do try to collect or connect information like that as much as possible to do that kind of analysis. They're definitely collecting. There's last Trump administration, there was an emphasis on collecting people's social media handles. So a lot of gang profiling has actually shifted into that space where more and more people are being labeled as gang members by law enforcement who don't actually interact with them in person, but are essentially stalking them on social media and are looking at their social media accounts and are designating them as gang members because they're with people in pictures or they're wearing certain things in pictures. So social media has definitely become this site for the collection of information. And, people obviously are just like freely giving up so much information on their social media accounts.
Yeah, it's hard reading the fine print on that, right? Like you use it for it's like a great networking tool, but then you realize like it's also data collecting. Every store you go to, every picture you like and all that. It kind of makes me think of like, was it phrenology, the study of like features on
Sure.
someone's faces? There was this big push to look at like brows and eyes, the distance between eyes, and this idea that you could create or create a map of the human face, and because if you had X amount of features, then that would automatically make you a criminal, right? Or this idea, or
Right.
it kind of also, I guess, lines up with eugenics, but it's almost like this data collection is like the new version of phrenology, right? And how much of it actually works, and for me, it sounds super scary, but I'm curious to see, like, does it actually work? And maybe we should also qualify what works means, right? So what do you think?
Yeah. No, I think it's a mess. I don't know. Like, but I see what you're saying, where there's this effort to identify characteristics and tie them to people and criminalize people through them. But yeah, I think it causes a lot of damage. One thing I did encounter a lot when I was looking at these databases is it's really scary. They have a lot of information. They have a lot of power to affect people's lives. There's also just a lot of incompetence, which doesn't make them any less damaging or scary. So there's I found lots of emails just panicking about certain things that they found in a database that shouldn't be there. I found in the gang databases, found people who were 1 year old or 100 years old. I mean, the data is a mess, but that doesn't keep it from really destroying a lot of people's lives.
How do we fix it?
Oh, I don't know. That's a big question.
Unplug everything and go back
Yeah.
to put foot cops or I don't know, right? Like I think there's such a big push to automate everything, for AI to take over algorithms, that I'm almost feel like we're falling into this waterfall into this abyss of unknown dystopic kind of outcome. Is there a way out? Can we use the algorithm in a better way?
Yeah, I mean, I like to look at counter uses of surveillance. So, for example, there was a great group in Chicago that had developed a database of problem police officers. And was documenting, their use of force charges and their disciplinary record. And I remember during the Black Lives Matter protest, there was a group that was actually looking at specific officers at the protest and looking up their records of misconduct and things like that. And in a bullhorn, were announcing it. And police were leaving the protest because they could no longer effectively. They didn't feel they could effectively, I guess, police the protest since that had happened. So those are instances where I'm really interested in how that technology can be turned around and be used to surveil people in power. But I tend to look at, I also feel at a loss, and everything is so big and everything's kind of left the station in a way. But what I tend to focus on, I tend to go back to what are people doing in communities on the ground to resist it in some way, or to turn this technology back on people in power in some way.
Have you found any examples of that are inspiring for you?
I mean, the Chicago example is inspiring, and I think there's local community groups who are documenting, agents of state violence in their communities and are surveilling those people in their communities. I mean, it's happening right now in Los Angeles, for example. There have been flyers around neighborhoods that are identifying ICE agents, right, that are doing raids. So showing their pictures, putting up their personal information. So that's a way in which, just turning that surveillance tool back on agents of state violence.
Yeah, I think, and even just empowering someone with information and sharing what their rights are, because a lot of times people don't know what you have the right to, right? One of the things is also just to don't incriminate yourself as one of them, but people love to talk when they don't really necessarily have to. And I think that's also really important. That's something that I've seen too, is people just informing whether they're citizens or here as immigrants, you have rights. You have rights not only through this country, but you also have human rights. And a lot of times those get ignored or abused, for sure. Do you feel like at some point, if we make a big noise about this, the way this information and these policies are used in a bad way, that eventually it can make its way to state legislature or the Congress, and there could be reform? Ultimately, is that what we have to do? Is we have to use the law and the bureaucracy that's already in place in order to put a check onto that bureaucracy?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think a lot about there are scholars and activists. I'm thinking particularly of work by a legal scholar named Amna Akbar, who's pulling from a lot of activist work, and she talks about the distinction, and other abolitionists talk about this too, this distinction between abolitionist reform and reformist reform. So I tend to be suspicious of reform as an effective mechanism. But abolitionist reforms, for example, Amna Akbar, defines these as things that sort of truly take power away from a police department, for example, rather than reinforce them. So one of her examples of reformist reform that's not effective and sort of strengthens a police department is body cams, for example. So they give the public this sort of false sense of comfort that there's some sort of check on police power, but they've immediately been turned into a surveillance mechanism, right? Police immediately wanted to put facial recognition on them, and we can see they haven't. In cases, they've been helpful, but overall, it doesn't seem like they've been extremely helpful in reducing police violence. But it does legitimize a police department that they can say, we've done this reform, right? And where this is this oversight mechanism. Abolitionist reform for Amna Akbar would be rescinding qualified immunity, for example, from police officers so that they can be directly prosecuted for acts of police violence. So I'm always thinking about that distinction. And if we're going the route of legal, if we're going a route of legislation, then what is something that will actually truly meaningfully make a difference rather than just reinforce that system? And I think I saw this a little. So I was involved in the 2014 reforms to the CalGang database, and I was really torn about their effectiveness and to what extent that was just going to make that database stronger and make it seem like it was more accountable without making it more accountable. But one thing that happened as a result of those reforms, as a result, for example, of those letters I was telling you about that needed to be sent out to people when they were added to a database or sent to their guardian when they're added to a database, is a parent got a letter saying that their child had been added to the database and contested it. And an investigation was done, and it was found that individual was unjustifiably entered into the database. So that an LAPD officer had fabricated information to put him into that database. And the investigation spread, and eventually they found, I think it was 16 or 18 officers, LAPD officers, who had been fabricating information on people in order to enter their information into the CalGang database. And eventually LAPD lost access to the CalGang database. So that's one example, of a reform, the sort of notification where I was worried, and I'm still worried that it could actually not change how the database functions, but could make people more comfortable with it. But in that case, it actually sort of, I think, really helped people to question the legitimacy of the LAPD and then gang profiling and policing in general when this whole fabrication scandal was uncovered. So I'm always interested in, I don't think ultimately legislation is the most promising route, but I'm always interested in whether it's policy or litigation? How can that be used as a mechanism for sort of mass movement growing? So for community empowerment. So how can we so for example, with the parental notification letter and that scandal that was uncovered, how can that be used as this center for a community to mobilize against the police and against this practice of gang profiling?
Yeah. And that for me, that makes sense, because I even think about like corporations. When corporations kind of change practices is when it becomes too expensive and they have to pay out because of lawsuits, and they then make the change, right? Instead of waiting for a regulation to make a change for some kind of practice. After the Black Lives Matter protests during the pandemic, there was a big push to really defund the police. There are some arguments that say just the opposite, that if we really want to make change, then we need to fund the police. If we really want better police officers, then we need better training. And in order to get better training, then we need more money, right? And then there's also a big push for militarizing the police with armored personnel carrier vehicles and rifles, assault rifles, and becomes a paramilitary force in itself, which then needs more and more money. So where do you fall on that? Do we threaten to defund the police so that they change their behavior? Do we defund the police and get rid of practices that are harmful and hurtful and counterproductive? Or do we fund them and train them and give them more money and hope that things get better?
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to what you look at as the purpose of the police, right? So I really, as a race scholar who studies the origins of the police and who studies police over time, it's very clear that the police, the purpose of them has always been racial control. It has always been to target and control and to commit violence against communities of color, particularly Black people. And they've continued to do this, right? Through the foundation of what we now call police, through slave patrols and vigilante groups, to Jim Crow laws and black codes, to the police opposing and using violence against civil rights protesters. So there is a clear thread throughout time that the role of law enforcement is to reinforce white supremacy. And so if that is the purpose, then that is always going to be the outcome. And reform will merely, reform won't change that, right? Because it doesn't change ultimately the sort of core endeavor of the police. So for me, I see the police as a health and safety risk. And a health and safety risk, particularly for Black people and people of color, and young people and other marginalized groups, queer people, trans people. And so for me, again, I always go back to sort of these very concrete examples in the community. So for me, I think about what are concrete ways we can reduce police contact with the public? Because I think when you have police contact with the public, it's a safety and health risk to the public. So I think about ways you can sort of chip back, you can chip away and sort of reduce the role of police in everyday life. And there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. I think there was some momentum around that after the Black Lives Matter protests. I think, unfortunately, some of that momentum has sort of faded away. But there are still communities doing really good work, replacing police with mental health professionals when they're responding to people who have a mental health crisis, getting police out of schools. There's low-hanging fruit like that where police have just expanded over time into so many areas of life where they don't need to be, they're not helpful, and someone else could be there and do that more effectively. And I think, the police budgets have just gotten absolutely out of control. In big cities, they're over $1 billion. Often in LA, the police budget is over half the budget. I mean, and we know that the things that build public safety most directly are when people have basic security in their lives, when people have access to housing, adequate housing, and food, and employment, and mental health services. And so the moving funding away from police to these things, I think, is the most promising direction.
What can communities do now so that we're not always having to worry about calling the police, having them come in. Like, I think you kind of mentioned some of that in what you were talking about. But I started thinking about like community watch programs, and we also have this, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but there's an app on a phone called Nextdoor, which is just, it's super crazy. And you get people talking about like, they lost their cat. And then you also get posts where like people complaining of strangers taking pictures of their home and going super crazy about that because it's an invasion of privacy. And then you find out later it's just an appraiser because someone is selling their home in the neighborhood, and you have an appraiser coming in and taking pictures of their home or the neighborhood. But you also get posts about suspicious people coming through. And I think that was kind of developed in order to have the community police itself. Whether it works or not, I don't know, because there's so many like false positives that get produced from these posts. But it's like it's like digital extension of the community watch program. Instead of walking the streets and getting to know your neighbors, you're just trolling on this application and then making posts about things that you think are suspicious or not suspicious. But I'm almost wondering, like, what else could be done, right? Or have you found communities that are super proactive in taking back communities?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky, right? Because there is this fine line sometimes between a community policing itself and vigilantism, right? So I never, would judge someone for calling the police or for accessing the criminal justice system in some way. Like, a lot of times that's people's only option. What I really love about abolitionist thinking is it's forward-looking. So abolitionism is really a question about what the world needs to look like so that we don't need to rely on police. And it's a project of imagination. So it's imagining what would we like our communities to look like, what would they need so that we don't need to rely on police. So it's forward-looking and realizing we're not there yet, and people very understandably might need to turn to the police. That might be their only option. But in thinking about other things we would need, and then working towards building a world like that, and for me it's just a very basic act of shifting those resources, of shifting our ideas of safety, right? So that safety is not necessarily this armed response, but safety looks like preventative and proactive things, right? It looks like people having adequate resources. It looks like people having mutual aid. So I actually think younger generations' use of and development of these mutual aid groups, for me, that's an abolitionist act. For me, I really admire and respect that, because it's this way of people committing to taking care of each other. But ultimately, people have to do that in the absence of public support. So there's just been this receding of basic public supports for people, and you sort of can't get around that safe communities need these basic resources that they're not getting. And I think, unfortunately, we're just going to see more of that. Obviously, that's something that this federal administration, right, has as a target, is to really take away the few safety nets that people even have left. And it's not a coincidence that, right, they're trying to reduce these safety nets, these public supports for basic resources, at the same time that they're trying to build up these militarized arms, right? Whether it's DHS and ICE or local police departments or military, right? So there's this very clear concerted effort where these things are connected, where you reduce people's resources and then increase the funding to agencies of state violence.
Why do you think that's works that way?
Oh, because communities are. I think part of it is just cruelty and greed, right? So wanting to wanting to hoard as many resources as possible and take those away from the people that are most in need. And generally, when you do that, when you really take away resources from people and you have societies where there's a lot of economic polarization, you have unstable societies, right? And so in order to control people, you have to build up these law enforcement arms.
And for me, it's like it just doesn't make sense, right? I try to wrap my head around why that would function that way. What's the end result? What's the purpose of that? I think a lot of it also has to do with just, are you poor or are you rich? Do you have resources or you do not? There's also the racial component and who's a citizen, who's not a citizen. But what's the end game result of defunding communities and making it difficult for communities of color or poor communities? Like ultimately, isn't that like suicide for a nation? I just don't understand why that would work that way. You try to wrap your head around it. Maybe it's like greed. It's this idea of, capitalism plays a role in it, and we all have to build ourselves up from nothing. And it's this Darwinian natural selection type of sifting filter that we all have to go through. But it just doesn't make sense. Ideally, I would want it to work just the other way around, where there's maybe I'm more of a communist than a capitalist, but I just and I also want to know like who they are. I have a lot of friends that are super into like conspiracy theories, and they're always like, they are surveilling us, they are watching us, they are controlling us, they are making the decisions for us. And I'm always thinking about like, what do they look like? Who are they? Can we actually name the person that's pushing the buttons and making these decisions? Is it a committee? Are we destined to fail from any kind of reform because ultimately they control everything? They have all the money. They have all the resources. Have you been able to kind of pinpoint like who is making these certain decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're talking about the immigration system, for example, so much of that system, the policy is done through administrative action. So like that's a very clear way where you can identify at the federal level, like who is setting those policies, who is making those decisions. But I think, one thing that is really missing in a lot of surveillance work, and I thought about this a lot when I was writing Borderland Circuitry, is because these policies are carried out, particularly the surveillance policies, the information gathering policies, the information storage and sharing policies, they're carried out by what's classified as intelligence agencies, and so you don't get a lot of access to them. But I am really curious, who are the people actually gathering the data, right, and maintaining the data? Who are the workers that do that? I got a little insight into that when I was looking at documents for this tool called the Risk Classification Assessment, and it's given to people when they first enter an immigration detention center, and they're essentially assessed to be given a level of security. So either this is someone who's like a high security risk or a low security risk, and this was an automated program. But there were still workers who administer it. And at one point, ICE there's the risk classification assessment. When someone puts the information in, it gives the recommendation that someone be released pending their court date, that they be given some sort of alternative to detention, so like an ankle bracelet, or that they're detained. And at one point, ICE had completely taken away the ability of that automated risk assessment to recommend release. So whatever information was put in, it recommended detention. And so ICE was using that as again, as we talked about earlier, sort of this idea, pushing forward this idea that technology is neutral and it's egalitarian, it doesn't have biases. So ICE was essentially pointing to the tool and saying, well, the tool recommended this, that everyone be detained, but they didn't mention that they had actually programmed that tool to detain everyone. But I found some really interesting documentation where there was almost this push and pull by the actual people, whether they were ICE employees or private ICE contractors who were in these detention centers, who were saying, well, no, like we make the I as the worker make the ultimate call. The risk classification assessment just makes a recommendation, but I actually I confirm that recommendation or not. So ultimately, I still have agency, and I am the I have the final say. And I thought it was this really fascinating, you could see this really fascinating effort by workers to almost not be made obsolete or not be sort of dominated by this automated tool. So that was this sort of small window of insight I got into like the actual workers that are doing these things. But I think we need a lot more research that looks at that. It's just very hard to access, right? It's very hard to get access to these agencies to be able to observe that.
And if the individual worker is deemed inefficient or too expensive, then what happens? What do they get replaced by another program that just automatically kicks that in? That's super fascinating. I think for me, it's kind of scary. I think of all this, and I immediately start thinking of like Terminator, like Skynet or the Matrix. What do you think is going to be the end result of this? I mean, we're living in the age of big data, right? Data all over the place. What do you think is going to be the logical conclusion to all of this data?
Yeah, it's a question I get asked a lot, and I'm just never adequate at answering it because I also feel overwhelmed by it and find it overwhelming, a little too overwhelming to think about. So I don't know. I know it's not an adequate answer, but I don't know. I think like many people at a loss in this current moment, just in the state of the world and the overwhelming amount of cruelty and suffering, and the way that these databases and information systems really undergird that and sort of exacerbate that.
Do you see any hope?
I see hope. Again, I always go back to like what like communities are doing. I see hope when I see just like examples of people in communities doing mutual aid, resisting, whether it's, resisting criminalization in their communities, resisting certain law enforcement actions in their communities. I mean, I think ultimately all we really have is each other. Like we just have to rely on each other and love each other. And that's mostly where I see hope. I think thinking about how to, as we've sort of been touching on and off through this conversation, like thinking about how to address these things on this like large legislative or legal or policy level. I think I don't necessarily see a ton of hope there, and I think that's where I lose hope thinking about that. But I'm always inspired about what people are doing just every day.
Yeah, maybe the next generation of young kids come up and grow up, and then they go into politics and make change, and we see things happen or policies reverse. Right, that's my hope, right? Because I always think about like Tiananmen Square, where there you have that protester in the tank, and how powerful the tank is compared to a human body, and sometimes binary oppositions don't work out for the little person. But if you take a subversive approach, and you are able to jump inside the tank, and then you can drive the tank, then you can stop it, right? Instead of trying to use your body to stop it, which you lose. So I'm always curious to see what's going to happen if we continue with these binary oppositions against power that can overwhelm, that has more money and resources, or if there's a different subversive approach where we can make the change from the inside. But we first have to get in there. We have to put the Trojan horse to the gate and then sneak our way in, and then we have access. Super fascinating. I'm so thankful to be able to talk to you about this, because a lot of what we do revolves around binational exhibitions and the exchange of culture and working with artists on both sides of the border. And we're also working on our next round of exhibitions that looks at the border as a paranormal space. And so part of this is asking artists, writers, creatives, scholars to help us define what normal is, if that's even possible, so that we can get an idea of what is paranormal. And, I usually like to ask our guests if you've ever had, however you want to define this, but have you ever had a paranormal experience?
I haven't, but I have always been fascinated by the paranormal. But So I'm open to it, but it has never happened. I think I told you this before, but in the past, I think I probably would have been someone who debunks seances, who goes in and like rips the tablecloth off. I haven't, but I'm fascinated by places that purportedly have sort of are paranormal centers. So if I hear about some place, like when I moved to Whittier, I immediately read up on Turnbull Canyon and the long reputation that has for being a paranormal space. I visited the Gates of Hell. And I'm a runner, and I really like to run. I really like night runs or runs before sunrise for that reason, because I like to go to spaces where that are rumored to be paranormal and be in those spaces either after dark or before sunlight. But no, I have found that humans continue to be the scariest, spookiest, most threatening thing.
But you also write about ghosts and hauntings,
I
but
do.
from a different perspective, right?
I do.
How does that work?
Yeah. So I'm really interested in racialized state violence as a form of haunting. And this comes from Avery Gordon is a sociologist who writes really fascinating books around this. So she wrote a book called Ghostly Matters. And in that book, she talks about mass disappearances in Argentina, for example, and Guatemala, as this mechanism of state terror, where governments were systematically disappearing large numbers of people during the Dirty War in the 1970s in Argentina in particular. And she talks about sort of what that does. So what it does when a state, instead of murdering people, instead of engaging in mass murder or assassination explicitly, like sort of straight out, where they do disappearances instead, where people know that person has probably been murdered but aren't completely sure. And she talks about it, it creates this present absence where something is so present in its absence, and it sort of haunts a population into submission. So it's this way of keeping a population from ever having closure, keeping them always unsure of what's about to happen. And I think of surveillance a lot like this, as this thing that, as this ghost that sort of like you never know when it's going to pop up. It always seems like it's there. It's sort of a shadow out of the corner of your eye. So I think about the ways that state violence and surveillance is this haunting force. I wrote about hauntings in particular in relation to this gang profiling and gang policing. And I was doing, as part of my research, I was observing immigration attorneys who were representing clients in the immigration system that they thought were probably going to be gang labeled. And they thought that most of these attorneys were working in Los Angeles. And basically when they would represent a young person from Latin America who grew up in a low-income urban neighborhood, they knew there was some possibility they had been labeled a gang member. And that's just like a huge group of people, right? But they knew they had to be aware of that, and that person might have been labeled a gang member by local police. And then through these circuits, I identify that label may have made its way to ICE. But they can never be sure. They weren't sure what information the ICE had on them, the government had on them. And so, for example, when they were applying for DACA for a young person who they were worried might have been gang labeled, they had to really think about that because if, for example, they were applying for DACA and that person, ICE had labeled that person a gang member, not only would they be their application for DACA be declined, but they would immediately be removed. They would be referred for removal. So it could turn this sort of this promising opportunity of getting DACA and deferred deportation and a work permit. It could turn it into a deportation. So they had to be very cautious about it. And it was really fascinating to me the low-grade anxiety they had about that possibility at all times. And because they didn't know if ICE had already labeled them a gang member, I was really interested in the way it sort of haunted their work. It was a sort of haunting mechanism that laced through all their legal work. And that is what makes something like a gang label so effective, is because you never know if it's there. It's kind of, it's always possibly there. It can materialize at any moment and completely derail your life. So yes, I'm interested in ideas of haunting and present absences and how that manifests through surveillance and state violence.
I think that's worse than just seeing a ghost. If you were to see one because you have that experience and it's over, versus something that stays with you and haunts you and causes a lot of anxiety. Definitely. What do you think would happen if you did see a ghost?
Oh, I think I'd be terrified. Yeah, I mean, I would like to. I would love it if I could keep my head cool and explore what's happening. But I think I would just, yeah.
It's funny. I've met a lot of people that have actively tried to go out and experience or see or capture a ghost, or even go to the desert and try to see a UFO, with no success. And then I've met other people that are like, yo, I've seen UFOs and they terrify me. I never wanted to see a UFO, but I've experienced it. Or my dead uncle came and spoke to me and terrified me, and I never wanted to experience that, but then I experienced it. And so I see both sides of that, right? I think for me, it's like, I think maybe I won't see one because it terrifies me and I don't want to. And I'll just push it away or rationalize it or make it into something that it's not, because the alternative is too scary, maybe. Yeah. I don't know. But thank you so much for being part of this. We're super excited to have you also work on the Mexicali Biennial as one of our humanities advisors as we work on the Paranormal Borders exhibition that's set to open in 2027. One of the venues is going to be the Cheech Marin Center for Chicano Art and Culture in Riverside, so we're super excited and about doing that program, and then also a series of border-based art actions and exchanges on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border, including Calexico, California, and Mexicali, Mexico. So thank you again, Anna, and we wish you the best.